Get started. We have a really nice panel today of some amazing scientists with some really cool backgrounds and experiences. If you haven't signed in and you need this for credit or anything, there's a sign-in sheet over there where you can write what class you need credit for. If you haven't done that, you could probably do it after the panel. So what we're going to do is have each of them introduce themselves, talk about a little bit of their history and their background for a few minutes, and then we're going to open up for a discussion for everyone. And I also forgot to say my name. I'm Emma Guthrie. I'm a biochemistry environmental science major. So we can go ahead and get started.
Me to go first,
Yeah.
I guess? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. And special thanks to Trevor and Megan and Emma, and love the cardigan there, by the way, for the invitation to today's panel and for organising such a fantastic event. My name is Stephen Willett. I'm Vice President for Amorex Energy Services and Renewable Solutions. We are the energy consulting division for a global financial services firm called Cantor Fitzgerald, who are headquartered at 55 Water Street in New York City. A little bit about my company, Amorex. We've been in business for 21 years, providing energy procurement and risk management expertise, guidance, market data, market intelligence to our many clients across the US. Our clients range from small McDonald's and Wendy's franchise owners to some of the largest manufacturers in the country. We also work with national retail chain operations like Dollar Tree, Marriott Hotels, and Wegmans, to name a few. These companies literally spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on their energy consumption spends. As today's panel is aimed at climate science and solutions, I want to talk a little bit about how Amorex Energy leverage our many corporate resources to provide renewable solutions to our clients. Although renewables and sustainability has been getting a lot of focus, attention, and headlines over the last couple of years, it's not a new subject matter at all. For us, it started to get serious and require more of our time and attention over 10 years ago, when one of our large university clients, Carnegie Mellon, asked us to provide them with a cost-effective solution that would help them to mitigate 100% of their Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions associated with their electric supply usage. For more information on that, if there's any interest, easy to Google CMU and wind energy, and you'll see a whole lot of information there. The result of our extensive research, once we took up the task, and countless meetings with potential wind and solar developers and retail suppliers, was that we were able to present and deliver a large utility scale wind farm project, load following supply sleeve, along with certified renewable energy credit package deal that still serves to offset 100% of CMU's electric power consumption. This was achieved without any capital outlay from CMU, and the electricity was ultimately delivered to the CMU campus meters at a cost that remains to be below what had been paid for by conventional grid brown power. So a win-win for all concerned. Upon completion of the project, the CMU spokesperson at the time gave the following statement, which I will quote as I feel that it exemplifies what I see is happening here at Elmira College. We believe that sustainability is far more than an academic concept or a performance target. It is a way of life that we reflect in our programs, courses, and student-led initiatives aimed at preserving our planet's natural resources for our future generations. I think that pretty much sums it up for me. You can see it in abundance here. Sustainability has a much wider scope than my daily vision, and daily focus. And I know how the discussion is now in good hands with my co-panelists, scientists, doctors, and professors here, who are obviously going to make sure that this is a good, informative discussion. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. So first off, as Steve said, appreciate you guys having us here. Look forward to having some conversation, hearing your ideas, learning from you guys, sharing some of our thoughts. So my name is Allison Yake. I currently work at Corning Incorporated in our corporate sustainability team. I handle a lot of sustainability initiatives for the company. But a little bit of background about me, just to share. I've got over 15 years in the specialty chemical industry, working in a lot of different segments. So if you ever go to like a Home Depot or a Lowe's, I probably help formulate products that are in those. If you ever looked at things that clean the floors, I've worked on those, paint on the walls. So maybe don't bring me to a store with you. All right, just some guidance. But I've spent a lot of time working on different products, thinking about how can we make them last longer? How can we make them work better? How can we use less ingredients for them? And so inadvertently, my whole career has pretty much been summed up with sustainability type activities. So I'm a chemical engineer. I worked in biomedical engineering. I've worked in drug delivery. I've worked in a lot of different areas. But now I work in material science, right? We do glass, optical physics, ceramics. And at Corning, we really are thinking about a couple of things, right? We think about how do we as a corporation talk about what we're doing, right? So the group I'm in, we handle setting targets for the organization, right? How are we going to reduce our emissions, right? How are we going to reduce our water utilization, our waste? How do we improve that? How do we help our businesses work with their customers, right? We work in all different areas. If you have a cell phone, we work in those spaces, right? If you have fiber optic internet, which I don't even have at home, but if you have that, right? That's definitely one way. Thinking about vehicles you drive. If you have a gas vehicle, there's an internal combustion engine, right? So there's substrates and filters that are in those. So we think about helping the businesses. We also look at how do we think about doing the right thing for the climate, right? And what can we do and how can we improve on what we're doing? And so the way we look at that is in three buckets. The first is kind of the base layer, right? This is sort of the right to entry, right? It's around regulation. And there's a lot of new regulations that have taken effect in the last year and will start to take effect in the subsequent years around reporting, around requirements. That's one piece, but the second phase of the regulation is what our customers are asking of Corning Incorporated. Right? They're asking us to reduce our emissions. They're asking us to use renewable energy. They're asking us to make products that are stronger and last longer. So that's a key challenge for us, and we're working towards that. So the second bucket is a little bit higher up. If we had a visual, you'd see a curve, right? And that's around what we call our footprint, very loosely. It's what are the things that you're doing from an impact standpoint around emissions, right? So this would be what kind of energy are we using? How much electricity? Are we using natural gas? Are we able to use alternative fuels? What does that look like? And so we're working on initiatives to reduce our impact on our footprint, right? So this can be using less electricity, right? Improving our efficiency of our operations and our processes. This could be changing to different fuels. This also is around material utilization, right? Can we use less material? Can we use it differently, right? So that's kind of the second phase. And there's a lot of that tied into reporting, right? We have to know our numbers. We have to know our data. And that's one big thing that I often talk to folks about is you got to know the data, right? You have to know your numbers and know what is. That way you can have a conversation with people. And the third bucket, which is really the highest form, is what we call handprint, right? And so handprint is how you can impact others on reducing their carbon footprint or their emissions. And so a couple examples of that are ones that Corning Incorporated has been doing for a long time. One of them is the ceramic substrates and filters. So as I mentioned before, right, internal combustion engines or diesel vehicles have these filters in them that take out particulates and reduce emissions, and typically carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and things like that. And we've been putting those in vehicles ever since about the early 1970s from the Clean Air Act that was implemented. So that's one way you can impact downstream, right? So that users of vehicles, people need cars, they need to get places. How can we reduce the impact of those vehicles? A second area is around fiber optic cable. So this is another big space for Corning Incorporated. And so we're working to improve the digital connectivity, right? There is a digital divide throughout not only the United States, but globally. So that's one space of how can we make this easier to implement, right? Can we use less materials? Can we reduce the size of these things, but also make them easier to connect? And so that's a big space where we're helping to bring broadband more broadly, but also thinking about the materials we use and how can we make them last longer, be easier to utilize, create less issues for folks during installation. So those are just a couple examples, but really how we think about the three ways, right? We think about kind of the base layer, what's required, how do we reduce our footprint, how do we help others reduce their footprint, and then impact long term with longevity of products and the materials we're using. That's it. So thank you guys. I'll pass it on to my colleague.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Zabel. I work at the Paleontological Research Institution in Ithaca. If you've been to Ithaca, you probably know us better through our Natural History Museum, the Museum of the Earth, and our Nature Center, the Cayuga Nature Center. I began working in climate change in scientific research. I'm a physicist by training, and now I work in education, but not in a classroom, not formal education. I would call it informal education at a museum and a nature center. And I thought today I would start by telling you a story. So in Ithaca, I'm part of a group, a climate action group that includes activists, business people, academics, nonprofits. And a few years ago, we had someone from Cornell come to our group and tell us about a grant program. They were funding climate action projects. So many of us were very excited because we thought maybe we could get some funding for our projects as community partners with Cornell faculty. And I asked the gentleman if we could put in proposals for climate education projects. And he said, no, they're not funding that. They only want to fund projects that have a measurable impact. So this was disappointing and also a little hurtful to think about his view of education, but maybe not surprising in a way. I think a lot of people don't understand the value of education. So I thought I'd give you a few examples of research studies on measurable impacts of climate education. So there was one that was published in 2020. It was based out of San Jose State University. And this project followed students who had taken a year-long intensive course on climate change at a university level. And then it followed them at least 5 years later, which is quite unusual for research studies to follow people that far into the future. And so see what impact this course had. And what they found was, on average, people who had taken this course had reduced their carbon emissions by almost 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. That's pretty significant. That's like equivalent of a car, a gas-powered car driving 7,000 miles or so, avoiding those emissions. And the people attributed their actions to having taken this course. So that had clearly, this was where education about climate change had a very measurable impact on people's actions. Now you could say, okay, well, that was a university course. Not everyone goes to college. It was a year-long intensive course. Not everyone who goes to college has a chance to take a course like that. But there have been smaller educational interactions too that have been effective. So there was one, I saw a study recently about in Japan, high school students had curriculum units on climate change and energy for just a period of 3 or 4 months. And they had little nudges to try to get them to save energy at home. So they had stickers that tried to encourage them to save energy, or they had recommendations for default settings on certain appliances that would save energy. And this study measured they got access to their electric and gas meters, and they measured their household use before and after these units, which were just once a week in a high school classroom. And they found something like almost 4% reduction in carbon emissions in these households. So kids were learning. They could take action, and it had a meaningful impact. And then finally, another study I'll mention, this is from North Carolina. Some middle school students had a climate change education program in their high school. Again, not intensive year-long, but a curriculum unit. And the study did not track the students, but tracked their parents. Their parents, and here they weren't looking at behavior, but they were looking at concerns. And they found that the parents of these students have become more concerned about climate change. So climate change education, it's not guaranteed to have an impact, but it certainly can.
Well, like they said, thanks everybody for being here. And sorry, I'm a little froggy this morning. So my name is Renee Owens, and I wanted to just give you a little intro about where I'm coming from, partly because I like to use it as an example, especially since it seems like many of you are students, of how you can take a trajectory that goes in all different weird directions and still get to somewhere you really enjoy being regarding a career and your other goals. And so, by the way, I grew up in Elmira. So even though I'm going to talk about living in other places, I guess that makes me a native. Um, and so I started, I started as a volunteer when I was 12. I started something called the Save the Tallgrass Prairie campaign. I had no idea what a tallgrass prairie was, but I started out on this trajectory and I decided I want to study animal behavior. That's what I'm going to do. I don't want to do anything else. Well, it turns out an opportunity came up for me after I got my master's to study overseas. It wasn't anything I expected, but I really wanted to work in the tropics. I went to Venezuela and Ecuador, and as a wildlife biologist, I got into some projects funded by National Geographic studying endangered species like crocodiles and anacondas. And then suddenly everyone and their brother came and were filming us. It was way back when the movie Anaconda came out, so you can just imagine the kind of media attention where it was very weird. I was in an extremely remote place doing some long-term research, and I'm surrounded by people and cameras. So that was an interesting experience for starters. But what I did there was contribute to some data and information that helped some conservation initiatives in place where you absolutely wouldn't expect them. A wonderful place, flooded wetlands called the Llanos. And we were working on there are a lot of giant ranches there, cattle ranches, not really like what we have here, very huge and spread out, mostly owned by oil barons and drug lords. So not exactly the people you expect to get into business with, but we introduced some ideas about conservation that actually became very popular to them when they saw they could take advantage of things like tourism. So that was an interesting road. And when I came back, I had started my own consulting business. I was really not sure what I was doing. I was still young, but environmental consulting. So the type of things I did, I also worked for environmental consultants because I wanted to learn how exactly these things are done. So a lot of the things I did were, and we still do, cover with a focus. My focus is in wildlife and habitat. So helping projects basically get us do what they need to do while keeping them in compliant with environmental regulations and reducing their impacts and that kind of thing. I've worked in a long time in the field of helping projects in solar and wind and renewable energies, but also with conventional energy, with clients who are into fossil fuel pipelines and electrical grids and things like that. So as I did more research, and I got into this business where I was really interfacing. I was also teaching, so I was in academia. So I was wearing all these hats. And the more I did research, I mean, part of me just wanted to be Jane Goodall and sit out and watch the animals and not worry about anything else. But the more I wanted to do that, more the real world kept coming in. And I went on this trajectory of deciding if I want to help wildlife and habitats, I got to learn more about people. I know that sounds a bit obvious, but I went back to school to learn more within the environmental sciences about the cognitive science of communication and how do we change minds? How do all these nonprofits I was volunteering for always said, how do we get more members? How do we keep members? How do we get them active? It's the ultimate question. How do we get people to buy things? How do we get people to adopt a sustainable lifestyle or corporations? So I suddenly now became a student of human behavior, not just animal behavior. And it is fascinating. I love it. And so I've got all these different places that I touch base to do the research. And so I think something I would like to talk about today is if you have questions about your future career trajectories, maybe something, what worked, what didn't, what type of things do we find more useful, especially as you're starting up, or maybe even if you're a teacher and you want to see things that maybe will be more relevant to your students right now. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna open it up to all of you guys if you have any questions for any of them or for all of them. So feel free to just speak out or anything.
I always have a trouble finding the correct definition to what sustainability is. Everyone I talk to has a different definition. I wonder if each of you would share with us what your definition of sustainability is.
That's a great question. And, and I think, there's no one set answer to that. I think for me, sustainability is all about, kind of look at your own situation, whether it's personal, whether it's business, whether it's, your local community, and just try to be more efficient, thoughtful, and responsible for your own actions. Whatever that might be, if it's leaving a room and turning a light switch off, whatever that might be. So, what I've learned from this panel, and speaking to, Renee, Ingrid, and Alison here, just over short meetings is, my focus is more commercially, focused, biased, and solutions, but it's a much wider subject matter that I can't even wrap my head around, honestly. But what I would say to students here, the sustainability kind of arena is absolutely massive, whether you want to be a scientist, whether you want to, help commercial applications, whatever it is, now is the time to explore all of those, those kind of rabbit holes, if you like, and get down them, really, focus, get down in there deep, ask as many questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and find where your passion is and just follow it. Have I got a couple of minutes here? Have I got a couple of minutes to kind of just expand on that a little bit? Oh, one of the things in commercial world that you often hear is follow the money. Where is the money? And, what I can say as far as just, if you just focus on New York State for the initiatives as far as sustainability is concerned, there's goals that have already been set, and there are literally billions of dollars that are being put into what's called a clean energy fund. Whether you realize it or not, everyone in this room and Elmira College have been contributing to this fund for a decade. And, since, for example, 2016, it's literally about $6 billion is in this fund to encourage renewables and sustainability actions, to drive efficiency. And all of this is contributed to the fund by adding a line item to everybody's bill. And this includes, your residential bill. It's called the SBC, the Systems Benefit Charge. And Elmira College, for example, have been paying into this SBC Clean Energy Fund for the past 20 years, to the tone of, certainly for the past 5 years, it's been close to $50,000 a year has been going into that fund. And, so what it means as far as the cycle of events here, as far as my view on sustainability is, play your part in that, make sure that those funds are spent wisely at, at doing the right thing, being responsible, holding companies, feet to the fire, so that it's not just a commercial thing. It's a planet that we all want, our future generations to enjoy. So that's my take.
I have a short, I think, answer. So this is my perspective on the world, right? So if you use ChatGPT, right, and you ask it what sustainability is, it's going to tell you it's ESG, environmental, social, governance. Great. Okay. Is that really what it is? So from my view, I look at it as a continuous improvement, not of just energy utilization or emissions. I look at it across the whole piece, right? So I think about from the very beginning of maybe a material, who are the people that are getting that material out of the ground, right? What are the communities that are being impacted? How does that transition all the way down to a final product that you or I might buy in a store? And where does that end up, right? What is the full sort of life cycle of that? So I look at it as sort of an opportunity to continuously prove everything that we're doing, right? How we interact with each other, how we interact with products, how we interact with companies. So that's kind of my take on that. And I think, certainly we'll call it the value chain, right? But not only just from an ingredient perspective, but the impact on people and how things are governed around that. So that's kind of.
Can I add a quick to that? I like, especially how she said, sorry, always doing better, improving. Especially how many people here are maybe going into the sciences? Maybe raise your hand. Don't be shy. We're really, really good at innovation. But when it comes down to, you hear sustainability thrown out all the time. What does that mean? I think the real important question is, how is that working by what we define as sustainable? And it's up to us as scientists and administrators and leaders to ask that question in depth and not stop at some black and white definition, which might, again, sound obvious. But when you're at the table with administrators and leaders and decision makers, it takes time, and sometimes it's very messy to get at solutions that are truly sustainable. For example, we talk about renewable energy. I have a very deep concern that we're backpedaling because we're setting the bar lower. Let's face it, this new administration wants to remove all kinds of funding and jobs that revolve around renewable energy resources. So we're at risk of slipping back into just saying anything renewable is good and sustainable, go. But as scientists, as young people, we can do better. We can address that problem, and we can still look at what happens when we, for example, let's look at wind and solar. What can we do that's affordable, sustainable? Can you afford solar panels? Can you afford these different things? We have innovative windmills that aren't windmills. Instead of a 400, 600 foot tall thing that has to go on thousands of acres, perhaps something I've had experience with directing. We've got ones this big that can go on top of buildings and dams and are highly efficient. I've worked with the military on designs like this. There are solar, wind, I'm not even sure what you would call them, but they look like a big flower. They're about 12 feet high, and they're little windmills and solar, and you can sit next to them and charge your phone. Why don't we have these all over campus? So you got to look deeper into what sustainable is. Where's the funding coming from? Where's the motivation? And let's keep setting the bar higher. We can do renewable, but if we just accept anything goes, it's up to us to, if we don't get it right and do better, who's going to, so we have to be the ones always pushing that bar to do better. Yes, there's compromise, but I can't emphasize that enough, and I'll stop talking now.
Well, I can give my definition of sustainability. I think it's to live and work in a way that protects the things that allows you and others to thrive. So for example, if you get your water from a well, if you pollute your well, you're going to suffer. If you grow food, if you allow the soil to degrade and don't nourish it, you won't be able to grow food. So that's sort of a, basic, I guess, theoretical definition in a way. But I also think there's an element of time. So I think living sustainably also means living in a way so that future generations will thrive.
Follow up on that. So sustainability, in my opinion, too, is part like environmental policies and whatnot, but it's also like social related. So they go hand in hand, right? Like you'll impact the environment through unethical social policies, right? So, for example, I have a question, and it's our phones, solar panels are, correct me if I'm wrong, made of like lithium, rare earth minerals. If you go back, those are being mined in Africa, very unethical. So my question is, how can you consume, and how can this campus, how can the college practice sustainable consumption And that can, and
Yes, I have a few thoughts on it. So one of the pieces there is a whole thing around due diligence, right? And so being companies, we work with companies that make phones and that, right? And so there's a whole part of understanding where things are coming from and who's being impacted, right? Where is that lithium coming from? Who's mining it, right? Is it children? Is it adults? Are they being paid fairly, right? There's a whole thing around that. I know we're focusing on the climate side, but they don't, you can't separate them, right? So if you make a product, and I have it like a personal example of this, right? So I got a new vehicle last year, right? And it had to be brought into the United States because it wasn't here, right? It got held up at the port for 4 months because they found out that there was child labor being used to make one of the chips. And it's banned in the United States. You can't do that. So I don't get a car, right? A very personal impact, right? I literally had no car. And I was like, huh, wow, this is a real thing, right? And so I called the manufacturer up and I said, hey, I would like to know more about this. Please explain to me what you're doing, how you're approaching this. And they were ready. They had their statements and all of that. And I said, I don't care about any of that. I'd like to know more, right? So I think there's a piece around asking questions, right? Understanding what is the process by wherever you're buying this, what are they doing, right? And sometimes there'll be information, sometimes there won't. But you can look up, right? Where is this coming from? What's that? Where's that? But it's across the board is really understanding. And a lot of companies are very forward with that. Especially you'll see that a lot with, in the textile space, you'll see a lot of companies talk about what they're doing, right? Where their products are made, how they're being made. But really trying to understand that and ask questions because that way you're an informed consumer.
I have a little bit a thought on that. So it's an excellent question because I think as I hinted at before, we're really good at innovation. There is so much fascinating. I think before when we spoke, Steve said this is a very exciting time. It is. There's so much going on. We could talk about just in my field of using remote sensing and the new ways we have of using genetic analysis to add to databases to look at biodiversity. And biodiversity is the foundation of us being resilient to climate change. But I'm going to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer by saying what I learned is most important to me, especially as an environmental consultant, is that the best science in the world and the best scientists need funding. And they don't just need funding, they need the jobs, and they don't just need the jobs, they need their company or their community's motivation to do them. And then we get into what regulations exist, because let's face it, we are in a capitalist world and we're always fighting profit versus what's actually sustainable, what isn't destroying our environment. And those are the realities we have to deal with. And then, as I've said a million times as an environmental consultant, the best rules in the world are only as good as oversight and enforcement. And as I think you might have a hint of, we're really losing that enforcement. And now it means you get involved in your community. Let me give you a little example. So for a long time, we've known that forests are really important for carbon sequestration, and they're important for a lot of other reasons. And we love our forests. New York took a little while to learn this, right? Quite not that long ago, we wiped out a lot of our forests, and we're doing much better now. But there's still timbering, in the Northwest, even sneaking into old growth forests. There's still a lot of clear cutting. If you're older like me, you heard all the hubbub about the spotted owl, and the spotted owl lives there. We can't protect the man timber, and there was a big deal, and it's kind of gone quiet. Spotted owl is still an endangered species. But don't forget, it's just a flag for the entire habitat. You can't save any species without their homes being protected. So the spotted owl is still endangered. So there have been years of discussion and how do we protect it? The Endangered Species Act comes with this basic requirement called protecting critical habitat. And the people who don't want to follow the Endangered Species Act attack that critical habitat, reduce it. So very long story short, the agency responsible for addressing this loss or protection or comeback of the spotted owl is our federal Fish and Wildlife Agency. So they've come up with a new mitigation plan. Mitigation's the magic world. By the way, when companies are told there's an endangered species, be aware the Endangered Species Act is very powerful. Never, never does it give agencies the power to say, no, you can't do that. They don't do that. The way it works is that they say, okay, you can develop your project, but you might have to spend a little more money here or there to do it carefully. We have to mitigate. This word mitigation, you'll hear a lot. So what's their mitigation solution now? They don't want to upset the timber industries, which is a very powerful lobby. They've decided an experimental research project, which consists of killing 500,000 owls, barred owls. Because barred owls compete with spotted owls, and the timber industry won't get upset if they go out and shoot barred owls. Yeah, it's a stupid, terrible decision, but it's been a long progression of a lot of politics and reduced involvement by the public. Everybody was very involved a couple decades ago. There are a lot of good stories about endangered species and habitat recovery, but I want to give you that one as an example how when you get involved from the start, it might seem very minor in your community. I'm a broken record. If the thing that you can do, what can I do? What can I do? To address beyond the science. You're going to be a scientist, you're going to learn a lot of cool things, basically. But if you want to apply that science, you've got to have funding, which is disappearing quickly right now. I'm sure you've seen that the elephant in the living room. Funding is being taken away. Scientists are being fired. So whether we like it or not, we've got to get busy in your local community. If you feel overwhelmed, like I can't do anything, I'm up against billionaires, get involved locally. How about, do you even know, I was this adamant student in the, in my 20s. I didn't even know how the basic structure of governance worked when I was at Geneseo. You know, I was out there like, we need to stop doing this and do this. And I didn't even know what a city council was, how they made decisions. And I know I'll stop in a second. The overriding state agency, the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, sadly, I guess they couldn't be here today. They do a lot of great things, but they have an awful lot of power unique to New York. Other states have wildlife, fish and wildlife, similarly named commissions. The DEC does it all. They're basically self-regulated, and sometimes that's good and sometimes not so good. But you can go on, and in my handout of how to get involved, I have their website, and you can go to hearings and you can volunteer and you can have your voice heard. And I just can't emphasize enough how it might seem parochial, but how important and what a great life lesson that is. I have so many great stories just from going to hearings. So thank you.
That builds on that. So where I'm from an area that doesn't necessarily prioritize the education of topics like this in favor of policies that restrict what our teachers are able to teach. So how would you recommend that we go about that? Because you're talking about like social policies and like social change. Well, a lot of people I talk to have kind of a more apathetic mindset, especially if they're not involved. So they're like, well, this doesn't affect me directly, or I'm more worried about this. How do you get?
Sorry, it's all good, right?
That is the question,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yes, that is what we're all sitting around going, how do we, like I said, how do we change minds? And you touched on it a little. You do have to make it personal. Something I learned a while ago as I started the studies back into human nature is that we intellectually understand concepts like biodiversity and all the things that are important to reducing the climate crisis. But if it doesn't hit you viscerally, it's getting harder and harder to get involved. Maybe you're just overworked and tired, maybe, you know. So how do we do that? And there are so many ways, and they might sound simplistic, but that's okay. Through the arts, having your voice heard through ways that connect to other people about what's important. Something progressive liberals, whatever you want to call them, aren't so good at is expressing our vision and our goals on a personal level. If we don't have a vision of how something can make us happier, do better, we're not good at going towards it. We have to articulate that. We have to literally have a vision. This is why Al Gore's movie was so good, because he spelled it out to us. This is what will happen. This is what we have to do, and not in a lecturing, polemic kind of way, a way that says, okay, what's important to you? That your water's clean, maybe how you can afford doing things that are renewable. I had a student say, well, I don't, someone else, another student was saying, don't support Walmart. And I had another student say, well, how can you not support Walmart? Because they're so cheap. But these are real world questions about sustainability, and it's about cultural shifts. And so one of the ways you go about it is just connecting to your community and having your voice heard, because we need to put the truths out there. This is a very big concept with the media. Support local independent media that talks to people. I was stunned by how many local media outlets have been bought up by the big corporations. The Star Gazette. I grew up with the Star Gazette. They're now owned by a big corporation, and you'll see the same story. How do we get our news? What's going into our brains? Repetition is how our brains actually gather facts and information. You can't teach somebody something they don't know. You can't pummel people with truth into changing their minds. So you have to repeat truths.
Just to add to that, and again, keeping it very simple, is, your question's a great question. We're volunteer panelists here. Keep the conversation going. Renee's got a lifetime of experiences. If I'm in your position, I probably wouldn't recognize it at the time when I was your age, but now I'm older. I would look at that and I would say, can I keep in contact with you? There's lots of use social media to educate yourself, bring yourself up to a level. You don't have to be a doctor or a professor. You have to, and again, Renee said it, you have to develop a passion. If you can develop a passion in any of the pillars or the areas of sustainability, just as one example, and if you can make a career out of doing the right thing and, earning a living at the same time, you're a billionaire. That's what it's all about here. When you get to, leaving college, having to get into the big wide world to find a job, having a family, needing money to support your family, things change. So now you're at the age that you are. Just ask the questions and keep asking the questions, and you'll get more back than you bargain for every single time. I mean, most of my kind of daily work is about, commercial economics and how can we achieve sustainability? Follow the money is part of it. Finding where these rebates and credits are, how we can kind of get to the objective here. But I tell you what, just in this panel here, I'm learning so much, because all of the individual people behind the business want to do the right thing. I absolutely believe that. And sounds like you're no different. Follow your heart and just kind of, be assertive with it and put yourself in position, and you'll learn, and, the next steps will determine themselves.
Thank you.
I just want to say I have students ask a lot, I'm sorry, that what are good things I can do to get into this sort of career? And it overlaps with your question. I think one of the most valuable things I ever did was just go live and work overseas, period. And if you're young and you don't have all those demands of family yet, or even if you do, just give it to your partner if you can. But do it And it doesn't have to be in a specific field you're interested in. Just the fact that you have the experience of working with other people and how to play in the sandbox. I've volunteered for decades, and I have learned more from that regarding working with other people successfully than I ever learned in academia, hard as they tried. So go find a place. There are internships, there are places, and yeah, you have to be a little poor maybe for a while, but it is absolutely solid gold worth it to go do an internship. If you can't go overseas, do one locally, but what you learn is priceless.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so I think you mentioned that in the community where you grew up, you felt like there wasn't adequate education about climate change in the schools. Um, so just one thing to know is there is legislation that's being pushed in New York State to try to advance climate change education statewide. This has happened before. There have been bills that come up and they've never passed, but everyone's hopeful that this one will pass this time. So if you want to see me afterwards, I can connect you with people who are trying to advocate for that legislation. And the other thing I would say is, I guess you're not in that school district anymore, you've moved on, but I do think if students go to school board meetings and just tell the adults that they want this, we want to learn about climate change. I think some of the school adults on school boards might not know that. They might not know that kids want to learn about these things. And so that's one specific way that you can, if you can get a few committed, energetic students to do that and do it over and over again, maybe the adults will start to listen.
Does anybody else?
It's all you.
100% about following money. Money is the reason that the environment is being damaged. Money is the reason why it makes it difficult to clean up. So Allison, my question to you is, what are your shareholders saying about sustainability and how is Corning responding to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think definitely shareholders have an interest in it, right? And I would say not just Corning, right, Incorporated. I would say across the board, shareholders are saying this is important to us. And what is your plan, right? And that is the first ask, really. And so making sure that we're making public commitments, they're validated commitments. We're having sharing of data, right? Everybody uses transparency, but you need to share your data. What are you doing? How are you impacting the environment, and what are you doing positively as well, right? So that is really where we see a lot of the ask is around making sure you're making commitments, you're going to deliver on those commitments, and then kind of what's the next step. And I would say more so than shareholders, our big driver is our customer base. And our customer base are all the brands that we all buy from, right? And so who is telling them they want stuff? All of us, right? And so it ultimately is coming from us, right? And that's why I always tell people, advocate to the brands, right? Ask questions, because if the consumers are pushing that, it will go upstream. And we're starting to see that, certainly, because I spent a lot of time talking to our customers and they're asking for a lot. And that's good. I'm glad to see that, because regardless of, whatever's happening in terms of the administration, regardless of regulations, if there is a demand from the consumer, that will drive this sort of market space, right? That will drive profitability. It will drive the revenue generation that's needed. So that's a big piece.
Yeah, in my flyer, I have a few little, and this is just a tiny sample representative of what I'm talking about. And I think there's a few copies up there, like I said, and it's just about documentaries and some websites to get involved in the things you can do just to jumpstart you. And as I have on here, vote with your dollars. You're going to hear that, but we are starting to feel like our lives are controlled by the billionaires, but they get their money somewhere. And so it really does matter. There are apps out now where you can look at what brands and corporations are funding whom. It matters, So you can, how do you buy your food? From whom do you buy your food? What do you eat? Since you eat several times a day, this is a really good way to be effective when it comes to climate change. And there are a lot of good groups out there working to create sustainable and climate friendly. The industrial agriculture industry is second only to transportation in contributing to greenhouse gases. What you eat, how it's raised, how it's grown, where it comes from makes a massive difference. So if you don't have time to do anything else, pay attention, get involved in the local farmers co-op. How many people spend a lot of time watching when and how the farm bill is going to be passed, right? Yeah. It's a federal bill that includes so much just about our food and health and nutrition and oversight. And we go crazy when it comes out saying, oh my gosh, pay attention to this, talk to your local representatives. So food is a really big segue into the science and the social structure of reducing climate change.
Do you have any last questions?
And so, like, do you have like a plan that you want to set out or like change you want to make?
Well, I'll give you actually an answer to something I already answered earlier. For me personally, I said earlier, my definition of sustainability is continuous improvement. And that is whether it's what I'm doing in the corporation I work for or my personal life, I'm always looking to improve, right? And whether that's my interactions with people, how I'm using resources, or what I'm doing and helping company deliver on our goals, that is what I'm looking for. Now, I happen to have an engineering mindset. I'm an engineer, so that's how my brain is wired. But I always look at how can we do things differently, right? How can we improve doing that? And so that's my sort of view on what my end goal is just to keep improving.
I would say I want people to understand why our climate is changing. Ideally at some depth, if they could understand like what are the contributions of food and transportation and electricity production, that can help people focus on what we really need to do. So again, first I want people to understand why it's happening, and then I really want people to understand what we can do about it. What are the solutions? What solutions make sense? Which ones are better than others? Of course, there's no perfect solution. Boy, if one could get people to understand lowering their energy use, that would be tremendous, because even though there are wonderful solutions to energy production like solar and wind, every source of energy at a large scale has some kind of environmental impact. So really, if we could all reduce our energy use, that would be the best solution. So that's what I want.
So I have a question for you. So in terms of like Elmira College, what do you think like we could do as a college and implement some of those ideas of like education? Because I know you do that, you have the museum in Ithaca, right?
Mhm.
So you probably know a lot about the education side of things. So what do you think the college could try to implement to
Well, so I don't know Elmira College's curriculum, but the college could require that every student take a course about climate science or climate change solutions. That's one. Interested students could go out in the community and do informal education with school children, or internships or projects at environmental organizations. I don't know if you have a community service requirement here. Yeah. So the college could push for that to be environmentally focused. Though I don't want to say climate change is the only problem in our world. There obviously, if students are working on other problems, that's wonderful too. So
you could first ask how much is Elmira College divesting from fossil fuel? And can you use that and connect it to things like, will there be alumni who want to give us more money if we are divesting from fossil fuels? So find a way to connect it instead of just a nice ideology, of course. And maybe I love that the class, of course, climate science, environmental science, maybe some encourage whoever is the person making the decisions for field trips to go and be in the world and look how things are done. Imagine if you took a whole classroom and went a field trip to your local congressional representative with a lot of questions. Oh, I've done a lot of lobbying in DC, citizen lobbying for free. And everybody says they don't listen unless you have money. Of course, they listen to those people. But let me tell you, they pay attention when you show up at their door, especially if you say, I vote. So a field trip to get comfortable in the how-to of working in the local community really is invaluable, I think.
Thank you. So I know session just ended. Thank you guys so much for coming. So if you need to still sign up to get credit for your classes.